Welcome, this is Chicken Fried here, and I just want to talk through proximity and is there potential counterplay to this deck? Um, has proximity been rising in popularity in your local meta? Has it been steamrolling your decks with its oppressive speed? Well, today I just want to talk through proximity, this newest and hottest deck around, and the potential answers to defeat it. Right here, we have Jesse Parker's list, who won the Pitch Black 3K recently, created by Andrew Mahone. And so if you're seeing this deck in your local meta and it's terrorizing all your locals, I just want to talk through what are potential ways you could adjust your deck to counteract this and be able to come back and beat this deck. So just wanted to start with what's good about this deck. So what's good about this deck is it takes advantage of Colorless strengths. And for that, I think Colorless has incredible draw and incredible prize mapping. So, for example, you'll see Chinchino, Babarrel, Squovit, and Oranguru, and that just provides a really strong draw engine that's really easy to set up. And so, with Colorless, you're able to draw through your deck and get what you need to take your knockouts. And then for the prize mapping, you have a lot of ways to take early prizes, mainly with Span Rotom, but there's other ways. And in mid game, you have the Hops Cramorant, followed by late game, you have Greedent. So, starting off with Toucanon, the newest, latest, greatest addition to Colorless, and what a lot of people have been very excited about for this deck. So, with Toucanon, you're able to KO high HP Pokemon like Wailord for just a single energy. And so that's something I have to give props to the deck for. It is definitely helpful in that regard. In addition, as mentioned, Hops Cramorant lets you easily take prizes on the 3 and 4 prize turn for just 1 energy, or potentially 0 if you have the Hops Choice Band. And so with these two amazing attackers, you have 3 ways to Gust. And I think this is quintessential for what the best aggro decks in the GLC format are. And fighting also has a similar build where you would have Boss or Lysander, Guzma, and an ability that can gust up one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. And so in this case, you have Hops Double, which can also serve as an attacker due to Hop Slacks and Hop's Choice Band and these triple energies we'll talk about later. And another card I wanted to call out was Lost City. And so Lost City is really good to take advantage of decks that are unprepared and slower decks, as you can, as mentioned earlier, with your 3 gusts, gust up a key supporter or attacker and lost zone it so your opponent can no longer play the game with it. And so this is very powerful, as if you're not built to be prepared for a situation like that, you can often just lose the game due to Lost City. So looking at the deck, there are also card choices that are exploitable. So first you see there's just Rescue Stretcher and Night Stretcher. And so that means you only have 2 ways to recover your Pokemon. And I know, as mentioned in this deck, you have so many attackers and you may not need to recur all your Pokemon to attack. But in this situation where you just have Rescue Stretcher and Night Stretcher, should your opponent play Parallel City and you have to get rid of 2 benched Pokemon, that puts you in a tough spot because now you have to use one of your recovery cards to get one of the Pokemons you got rid of. And say this is Babarrel, you got rid of your Bidoof, you have to get it back, you evolve in Babarrel, your opponent gusts it up and KOs it. Well, if you use Rescue Stretcher to get the Bidoof, you can't get the whole line back. And so now you're relying on your suboptimal draw. Granted, it's still strong, but still hurts the deck overall. In addition, Toucanon is a stage 2 line, so you would have to rely only on Rescue Stretcher to bring back the entire line should you need it again in a certain matchup. Moving along, you also have no escape rope in this deck. So, as mentioned earlier with the prize mapping, you can easily take early prizes with Fan Rotom. However, if your opponent has a Pokemon that has more HP than what Fan Rotom can do, then you cannot take that early prize. And should your opponent take prizes before you are, it creates a hard situation because you only take one prize at a time. Colorless as a whole, you don't really have good comeback mechanics. You are taking one prize at a time, and you hope that you are more consistent than your opponent in setting up the follow up attacker and taking those knockouts. And so, in those situations where you are unable to take that first knockout with Fan Rotom, it makes you vulnerable should you lose that Fan Rotom in the active. It's also worth calling out that you would need a Pokemon with more than 110 HP, as Colorless can potentially have Muscle Band and Powerful Energy attached to the Fan Rotom, hitting for 110 on the first turn. In addition, this deck only plays special energies, and so special energy disruption can slow down this deck. There are several decks already playing it to counteract Okidogi, but that can also affect this deck. So for card choices, I wanted to talk through comeback cards. So as you can see here, we got Counter Catcher, Counter Gain, Reversal Energy, and Counter Energy. And so these are cards that count as comeback cards, where if you are behind, they provide a very powerful effect. So starting with Counter Catcher, this provides Gust on an item card. And as discussed earlier, the best aggressive decks are playing 3 of these in the form of Boss, Guzma, and in proximity, Hops Double. And if you're playing a slower deck, Counter Catcher is very powerful, and once you fall behind, you can gust up a key support Pokemon or a key attacker they're setting up and remove it. But you can also use it to stall. You can gust up a 2 retreat Pokemon and hope your opponent falters and is stuck for 1 turn, buying you an additional turn of setup. And then for Counter Gain, Reversal Energy, and Counter Energy, these 3 work as cards to help bring up the tempo. Usually when you're setting up an evolving deck, you're taking turns to evolve your Pokemon, attach to attack with setup attacks. And that means when it comes to attacking with your main attacker, you might not have the energy attachments required to attack, or you don't have the time to set up your energy accelerator to put everything together. And so Counter Gain, Reversal Energy, and Counter Energy give you opportunity to gain back that tempo through these powerful effects of using less energy or cards to still pull off your attack. Moving along, there's also stadiums, and so these are also universal cards that almost all types can include in their decks, and through that they're able to slow down the proximity deck. On the very left here, we got Team Rocket's Watchtower. And so this is just a hard counter, right? It literally says colorless Pokemon in play have no abilities. It does not work against any other type, but it does really good job at what it needs to do, which is shutting off all that draw engine and gust that we've talked about from the strong colorless abilities. To a lesser extent, you also have Silent Lab. And Silent Lab says each basic Pokemon in each player's hand and each player's discard pile has no abilities. And that's pretty powerful against the proximity deck. In proximity, you have these support Pokemon that are basic Pokemon. And so Silent Lab would shut off the Squovit, the Oranguru, and the Hop Snorlax. And the key thing to call out with the Squovit is if your opponent's hand is already 5 cards, or 3 cards if they don't have a barrel, if you shut off the Squovit, they can't dig harder. And Squovit's ability is really powerful in the way that you can shuffle your hand to the bottom of your deck and allow you to dig deeper in the deck to find a very specific card you need. And in certain cases, it's like your triple energy, your tool, Lost City. And so that's what makes Colorless so consistent and powerful. But Silent Lab puts a halter to that and can really put Colorless in a tough situation. Next up, we got Parallel City, which we've discussed earlier. A lot of times with the proximity deck, you have a very tight bench. You would usually have around 3 support Pokemon. And so if you play Parallel City with the side that limits your opponent's bench to 3 or less bench Pokemon, they are forced to make a decision. It is either you play 3 support Pokemon on the bench, and now you have to chain these attackers through your hand, or you have less support Pokemon on the bench, and now you can't go through your deck as quickly or as efficiently as before. And then lastly, a very generic response can be Temple of Sinnoh. This is for decks that have less special energies, thinking about like water, fire, and metal, which have a higher count of those basic energies. The key hits that you want to hit with Temple Sinnoh is shutting off gift energy, and also recycle energy would be removed if you knock it out while Temple Sinnoh is on the field. Also, it stops the triple energies for the double attack. If you expect your opponent to need to use doubles attack the following turn, having Temple of Sinnoh can slow that down. However, it's also worth noting that this is a very passive effect unless you use it in combination with the gift and recycle energy. So your opponent can still go through the deck and draw with the powerful draw support Pokemon we talked through and get a stadium bump to still use their special energies like the triple acceleration and ignition energy. Another good way to deal with proximity is ability lock. This can severely slow down the deck where they can't go through the deck as quickly and draw the cards they need. It is also worth noting that these Pokemon are much slower though. So should you want to use them, you want to use them in conjunction with either setting up a very strong board as is Psychic, where I believe if you can get all your stage 1s, your Gallade set up behind the Wobbuffet in time, then you should be able to win the rest of the game. However, if you're just sitting behind the Wobbuffet, your opponent can still take it down pretty easily, and that just doesn't help you win, and you'll just be run over maybe 1 or 2 turns later. On the other side, we got Galarian Weezing, and so Galarian Weezing also shuts off the abilities. And so what's cool about Dark is you have Guzzlord, and so Guzzlord provides a lot of pressure against the proximity deck. You can sit behind Galarian Weezing, but as mentioned with Wobbuffet, you only have 1 or 2 turns, but if you make the most out of those turns, it can really flip the matchup. And so talking through with Guzzlord, you have these multi-prize options. We talked through how Colorless can only take 1 prize a turn. And so that means with 1 prize a turn, they'll take at a minimum 6 turns to win the game, to take all 6 prizes. Meanwhile, if you're able to take multiple prizes in a single turn, you can not only catch up to your opponent's proximity deck, but also get ahead. And so with Dark, as mentioned with Weezing, you can set up Guzzlord, use Red Banquet, and if you're ahead in prizes, it's very hard for the proximity deck to come back and even up the prizes. And so over here on the right, we also have other options for other types. We got Wo-Chen for grass, Deoxys for psychic, and Heatmor for fire. So there's just multiple options between the different types, and if you're just thinking about these cards, you can really do well against the proximity deck and take advantage of it. In conjunction with the multi-prize attackers, you also have spread attackers, which serve a similar purpose. In fighting, you have Ting-Lu, and in lightning, you have Electivire. With Ting-Lu's Ground Crasher and Electivire's High Voltage Current, you can take a lot of prizes. And one of the weaknesses of Colorless is they have no bench barrier, which means there's no way to prevent these spread attacks from doing damage to all of their bench Pokemon. And so in Colorless, you have these low HP support Pokemon. And so with Ting-Lu, about 2 or 3 Ground Crashers can do a lot of damage. And with Electivire, 3 High Voltage Currents will knock out almost everything on your opponent's board. And so these are very powerful and very scary for the Colorless deck. And so if you're able to get those attacks off, you should have a good time into proximity. So I just wanted to go through an example deck list that I have that kind of takes what these cards I've mentioned into an example. And so starting off, just talking about those comeback cards, this deck plays Counter Gain, Counter Capture, and Counter Energy. And so I want to call out Reversal Energy is not in this deck due to the fact that it's not very good with the rest of the cards. Reversal Energy only really works well with Sawsbuck, and at a point, it's not quite worth it. So we have these comeback cards, but also we have a multi-prize attacker. We have Wo-Chen. And so Wo-Chen, I think, is Grass's strongest attacker. Being able to hit 20 to the active and 120 to 2 benched Pokemon is very powerful. And that usually works well with Silent Lab, because Silent Lab is what you'd use to shut off bench barrier abilities to take those bench snipes of 120. But as mentioned about Silent Lab, it also does really well into proximity with the support Pokemon. You can snipe with Wo-Chen to knock out a barrel, and the rest of their support Pokemon are going to probably be basics. In addition, you might be wondering, how am I going to get to the bottom of the deck with this deck? And I think all decks, grass decks with Beautifly, can easily get there. Grass decks usually can search out the Pokemon really well through its own abilities and stadiums, and then with Beautifly, you can go through the items and supporters to turn through the deck and get to 3 or less cards. And then lastly, I wanted to call out Guzma and Hala. If you're playing an evolving deck, I highly recommend the Guzma and Hala package. And so this is Guzma and Hala, TM Evo, Artisan, and Capture Energy. And with this combination cards, you can use Guzma and Hala, which is 1 card in your hand, to immediately get 2 stage 1 Pokemon. You can get Capture Energy and Artisan, and attach Capture Energy to your active Pokemon to get a basic. Artisan can get another basic. And with TM Evolution, you can evolve both of them into a stage 1. And so this speeds up your evolving strategy to be able to counteract aggressive decks. So I'll talk more in depth of this deck in a separate video. I just made it back when RDT was on the rise, and it felt very strong into it, in addition to Colorless. And I think it really puts into effect of all these cards I've talked about on how you can address the aggressive nature of proximity and turn it on its head and be able to win. So just want to end with some closing thoughts. For proximity, I think it was a very good deck check for greedy people trying to build their decks for a slower meta that Psychic was shaping. Psychic is usually a slower deck. You evolve and set up your board to start taking prizes. And in addition, because everyone thought Psychic was the best type, it was a race for who could get the most value from their cards in the mirror match to win. That's why a lot of Psychic decks were cutting Wobbuffet, because with Wobbuffet, it's not helpful against any of the mirror, because Wobbuffet shuts off all non-psychic abilities. So then that let all these other decks that might have relied on abilities and struggled against Wobbuffet to come out. And then in addition, the most aggressive deck at the time fighting, Psychic can attack for weakness against fighting. And so there wasn't really a need to build your deck around these aggressive strategies that Colorless presents. And then so lastly, I also want to talk through Toucannon. I know everyone's excited about it for the Colorless deck, but I don't think it solves the core issue with Colorless, where you are an aggressive deck that if you falter, you can't come back. You are just hoping your opponent falters in their setup or in their attack. And so the best comeback that Colorless has is using Reset Stamp and Hex Maniac. But that's only for 1 turn. And so if you are unable to get something to stick with Reset Stamp and Hex Maniac, and you are behind in Colorless, and your opponent is set up, it's hard to come back. And in addition, just want to call it, like, Colorless could have already KO'd Wailord without Toucannon, so Toucannon doesn't really help much in that regard too. But let me know if you agree with any suggestions, or you plan on adjusting your decks for proximity with these adjustments. Happy to hear how people feel about it, but it's definitely worked out well for me. Thank you.